Thanks, Chair, and thanks to the witnesses for all of your work and for attending today. I have a number of questions, but maybe I'll avail of later rounds as well. I just want to focus on the issue of the models again, and if I could ask two things. One, the information gaps, so the data sets, the input variables, so the gaps that were there when you started your work and the gaps that remain, or the weaknesses in information. A similar question in relation to the models themselves. This is pioneering work you're doing, and we're all very grateful for it, and it is hugely, hugely important, because what comes out the back end of it has a real significance and impact on policy and on people's lives. So if I could ask for critical reflection in terms of the models we're using. So there are three, as I understand it, and various other submissions from parties. But the strengths of the models and the limitations or weaknesses, or you know, whether it's specifically in relation to the model or in relation to the information going into it, and just a question then in terms of the future. You know, would you envisage that these models, we would end up with a unified model, or we would continue with the, you know, the focus in terms of energy, in terms of agriculture and land use? So just those questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy O'Rourke. Professor O'Gallagher.
Thanks very much, Deputy O'Rourke. These are great questions, and again, I'll defer to Dr. Daly, Dr. Hanrahan, and Dr. Stiles on the individual models. Just in terms of my own initial reflections, the information gaps. We hadn't modelled this level of deep decarbonisation before across the sectors, so that was a key information gap at the start of the process that we were able to shed some light on at the end of the process. But while we worked intensively in the 6 months, we weren't starting from scratch. We were building on years of modelling capability and capacity that we were able to draw on, and that's hugely important. And that speaks to your point around the future. I think it can. Sometimes, because a lot of this work is invisible, sometimes invisible to the policy system until we have a situation like this, I think it's hugely important that these models be resourced on a continuous basis. There are gaps, there are challenges. One of the key broad gaps I would point to is on the societal side. We're quite good on the technology, we're quite good on the economics. The societal dimension, because of the transformation we're talking about, is you know, possibly the biggest gap. It would be the biggest gap in my view, but others may have other. The strengths and limitations, again, broadly in terms of the strengths of each of the three models is, and the reason there are three models is they're focusing on very specific things, very specific sectors with their own dynamics, inputs and outputs. A personal view would be that we do need to have some kind of I don't know if unified model is the right approach, but certainly bringing together of the modelling capacity, like we've done in this 6 months. I mean, I think it's been very valuable, and what we've been able to do in this period is actually show, you know, how far can we go across these sectors, but on an individual basis. There's a lot of interactions across sort of land use in terms of bioenergy, for example, on the energy side and on the agriculture side. So there's a lot of interactions, and there's a lot we could build on. I think what we did manage to do in the 6 months was phenomenal, and I really appreciate I mean, a lot of the Oireachtas committee members have commented on that. I think we have made a valuable contribution. I think we have done something solid. modelling is never finished. It's always an ongoing piece, and I think that critical reflection is very important in terms of thinking about your last question, the developments required in each of the models to progress this work. And to be able to take into account more fully some of the things that we weren't able to take into account. And secondly, this question of the interaction between the different sectors. So thank you for that. But I'll hand over to Dr. Daly, Dr. Hanrahan, and Dr. Stiles on the individual models. Thank you.
Thank you. I would, of course, echo much of what Brian has said about the need for kind of continued support and capacity, because while there were a number of data gaps, I suppose what is a real bottleneck is our capacity to feed into this process. So, for example, through this process, we're training PhDs both in modelling but also communications. So what can really improve the process like this is if national data sets are as freely available and open as possible, so that we can build from the data and from the modelling of other groups and replicate it and update as things change. So I think a principle of making data as open as possible would really assist this process. But modelling itself is one part of this whole process. There's kind of defining the question, creating the model, producing the results, and engaging in this iterative engagement between the policy system, stakeholders and the scientists. And I think what would be ideal is to have this process to be as sort of iterative and strong as possible, so that we can kind of gain insights into how, because we can say, for example, within the models world what kind of scenario is feasible, but we can't make judgments about what scale of change is politically feasible or societally feasible. So that's really important. I would agree with Brian that going forward, it would be ideal to improve the representation of society and of demands and the distributional impacts of these energy scenarios, because our models don't assess this now. Basically, who pays, what type of finance is used, and what the impacts are. But also, I think it's very important to look at the co-benefits. So where the reduction in air pollution comes as a result of climate mitigation, where potentially good quality jobs come, and as correspondingly where jobs are lost. So to integrate the kind of wider sustainable development goals into these models, I think will be a priority going forward. About your another big priority for the energy system model, at least going forward, is to equip it to look at net zero to beyond 2030. So we've done a big shift in the model to focus on the next decade and how quickly the system can change. But then we want to move the focus to beyond 2030. For example, how ambitious can we be for the third carbon budget period? So we've got an over 8% annual reduction in emissions in the second carbon budget period. Can we sustain that or even grow that? Can we perhaps bring that date of net zero forward as the urgency of climate mitigation becomes more apparent in the coming decades? And a final word I'll say on the integration of models. I think as we move towards 2050 and net zero, the interactions between the food system, the land system, and the energy system will become much more apparent. There will be synergies, and Dr. Stiles alluded to some of these, for example, using wood for bioenergy as well as construction, which will replace cement. That lots of different systemic kind of interactions, but that will create competition for agriculture. There'll be trade-offs. For example, rewetting land will reduce the capacity to both grow a forest and to produce food. And so I think I would like not necessarily to make one fully integrated model, but to represent these interlinkages between energy, food, and land in the context of carbon neutrality will be the main priority. Thanks.
Thank you, Dr. Daly. Dr. Hanrahan, I think is next.
Dr. O'Rourke, thank you very much for your really insightful and sharp questions. To talk about just to put on the ball from Dr. Daly in terms of the unified model, I think the models are representations of reality, but all models are wrong, but some models are useful. And the demand from users of our analysis is to capture the complexity of the issues to hand. So they want, our stakeholders want to know about what happens to cow numbers, what happens to sheep numbers, how much oats are grown, etc., etc. So when the models are asked for that level of complexity, unifying them is almost an impossible task with things like an energy system model that runs in a time step of hours or minutes. So it's really a massive task, and I'm not sure it's one that will yield benefits commensurate with the amount of work that would be needed to unify them. That would be my own personal perspective. In terms of the gaps, I think the work with the committee and the feedback from fellow members has pointed to a gap that we are going to be working on filling in terms and trying to think of how to do it in some sense, is the idea that some of the changes we considered would lead to losses of output from agriculture. But the land resource that's there could be used to produce other things. But those other things are often things that have never been done before or done before at scale. And how do you represent that in a model? So we've got that's something we need to tackle. So, there's never been the quantity of Irish agricultural land that's used to grow horticulture crops, for example, is minute and hasn't been very large since before the famine. So in terms of so how do we parameterize a model for reality that hasn't existed in modern history effectively? Okay, so that's a big challenge. So that's a gap that we need to try to think about filling. I think the bigger gap, and this talks to some of the concern about our ability of the models we've used in this work to talk about wider society issues, is really the absence of a unified macroeconomic models analysis that could tell us something more about the distributional implications across high-skilled, low-skilled, rural, urban, different strata, different ways of thinking about society, different industries. And I know that the ESRI did work for the committee, but their involvement in the process came so late in the day that it wasn't really able to be a fundamental pillar of the technical report. And I think going forward, given the scale of the societal change we are actually considering, I think behoves Ireland's socioeconomic and analytic community to really to be much more involved in this question, because I think it's like it's changing the bedrock of an awful lot of things that we need to think about.
Thank you, Dr. Hanrahan and Dr.
Just add one other point, a point of difference, I guess. One of the things that when you think about agriculture specifically, because we are so export orientated, that by construction, you need to think about what's happening in the rest of the world, both in terms of agricultural markets, agricultural policy, and down the road, climate change policy in terms of how it affects other industries in competing countries, how it affects the demand for the type of products that we produce in Ireland. And I think that's a very important consideration, and it's one of the reasons why it's so difficult to move to a 50-year time horizon, because you have to make an enormous assumption about what the agricultural policy is going to look like between now and then, and that really, to a huge extent, will predetermine the path that you travel on. And certainly, I'm not an expert in forecasting how policy will develop, but the role of the policymakers, both domestically and at a European and at a global level, is sort of endogenous, and it affects all of this stuff, and we need to think about how we reflect that in our work.
Thank you, Dr. Hanrahan. And Dr. Stiles, did you want to come in on this as well?
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I don't have a huge amount to add because I think it's all been articulated very clearly so far. I think specifically with regard to the modelling in the land sector, we used a model which draws upon recent models we've developed in the past to use for agricultural emissions, to use for different land management and for forestry. I think there are some significant emissions gaps because we very much looked forward to a 2050 perspective and took what we call the backcasting approach. So we tried to imagine what the future could look like, irrespective of what it looks like now. What are the possibilities of the future in terms of land use combinations that are compatible with net zero? And we work back from that. And I know UCC have done a bit of work on this, and because of the transformative nature of what we're looking at, my personal view is such modelling is quite useful. Doesn't give you any kind of right answers or predictions per se, but it shows you what's possible within the constraints of what we know we need to do to get to net zero. And so I think it's quite a useful approach. And my view would be we need to encourage modelling to be very prospective, so that we do look at future trajectories and we're not confined to extrapolations from the past. And that's perhaps the danger of relying heavily on models which have been developed hitherto. Often they're parameterized using data that we've had on current systems, and when we're talking about transformation, those systems are no longer relevant. So that's a challenge. That's a fundamental challenge. There's no easy way around it. I fully agree with what Kevin and Hannah have said about kind of unified models. It'd be very difficult to ever achieve that, but there's great potential for coupling models and to make sure that outputs from one model are designed in a way to be compatible with data inputs to another model. And I think the best way of making that happen is for kind of large-scale research, long-term strategic research investment that encourages collaboration across institutions and research groups, because that's the way that these things happen. Just a minor point, perhaps, to finish off, something that we're very conscious of with our kind of backcasting approach and what could be compatible with climate neutrality in the future. The big uncertainty there, from our perspective, is the degree of decoupling that's possible from animal emission intensity, which could be very sensitive to future technologies around methane abatement and cattle, etc. And things like that are very difficult to do, to forecast, and we're just going to depend on these models being iteratively updated through time to ever come to any conclusion on that. So we can't really, that's one of the ways we can't really predict the future. We're going to have to keep updating these models with revised parameters as the technology develops, and so you'll never have a finished model. It's an ongoing process, as I think Breen has alluded to previously. So that's just a little bit of insight from my side.
Thank you, Dr. Stiles. Okay.